We've all been there. The slow driver in front of us, the coworker who takes credit for our idea, the endless waiting when we're in a hurry, irritation, frustration, anger. It bubbles up before we even have time to think. And in that moment, we have a choice. Let it control us or use it to drive us forward. Because here's the truth. Anger is energy, and energy can destroy or it can build. The greatest leaders, the most impactful innovators, and the people who change the world don't avoid anger, they transform it. So how do we turn irritation into inspiration? Let's talk about it. Anger often gets a bad reputation. We're taught from an early age that it's something to suppress, to hide, to push down because it makes us look weak, out of control, or irrational. We hear phrases like, "Don't be so angry, calm down," or "let it go." But what if anger isn't the problem? What if, instead of something to avoid, it's something to understand? Anger, at its core, is a signal. It's our mind and body's way of telling us that something isn't right. Just like physical pain warns us when we touch something hot, anger alerts us when something important is at stake. It's an internal alarm system designed to protect us, to wake us up to something that requires our attention. The problem isn't anger itself. The problem is how we interpret and respond to it. Imagine you're driving and suddenly a warning light flashes on your dashboard. You wouldn't ignore it, right? You wouldn't cover it up with a piece of tape and pretend it's not there. That light is giving you valuable information. Maybe the engine needs oil. Maybe the tire pressure is low. Maybe something deeper needs fixing. But if you don't pay attention to it, you risk a bigger breakdown. Anger works the same way. It's a dashboard light for our emotions, flashing when something is misaligned, when a boundary has been crossed, when an expectation has been shattered, when an injustice has been done. And just like with the warning light in the car, we have two choices. We can investigate the cause, or we can ignore it and let the problem escalate. Think about the last time you felt truly angry. Maybe it was a situation at work where someone dismissed your ideas. Maybe a friend broke a promise. Maybe you watched something on the news that made your blood boil. That anger wasn't random. It wasn't meaningless. It was pointing to something deeper. Maybe it was a need for respect, a desire for fairness, or a sense of responsibility for something bigger than yourself. The key is recognizing that anger itself isn't telling us what to do, it's just giving us information. The challenge is in what comes next. Because if we treat anger as a sentence, as a final judgment that locks us into a destructive path, we risk making decisions that hurt us and those around us. But if we treat it as a signal, as a moment to pause and reflect, we open the door to a more thoughtful and productive response. Some of the greatest movements in history were born from anger. Not reckless, uncontrolled rage, but a deep, focused sense of injustice that led to action. The fight for civil rights, gender equality, and countless other societal changes didn't start with apathy. They started with people who felt anger and chose to use it as a tool for change. They understood that their frustration was telling them something important, something that needed to be addressed, something that could not be ignored. But anger, when misunderstood, can also lead us down a destructive path. When we don't take the time to interpret its message, we risk lashing out at the wrong people, making decisions in the heat of the moment that we later regret. We let it fester, turning it into resentment, or we explode, causing damage that's difficult to repair. This is why learning to listen to anger, not be consumed by it, not be controlled by it, but truly understand it, is one of the most important skills we can develop. Because anger, at its best, isn't a weapon, it's a guide. Anger is inevitable. No matter how composed or rational we think we are, there will always be moments that test us. Moments where irritation bubbles up or frustration simmers beneath the surface, where something or someone triggers a powerful emotional surge within us. And when that happens, we have two choices. We can react or we can respond. At first glance, reaction and response might seem like the same thing, but they are fundamentally different. A reaction is immediate, impulsive, driven by emotion without thought. It's the sharp reply in an argument, the honk of a horn in traffic, the email sent in frustration before we've had a chance to cool down. A response, on the other hand, is intentional. It's the pause before speaking, the choice to engage thoughtfully rather than emotionally, the ability to process before acting. And the difference between the two can mean everything. Think about the last time you reacted out of anger. Maybe someone criticized your work in a meeting, and before you could stop yourself, you snapped back defensively. Maybe a friend said something hurtful, and instead of addressing it calmly, you lashed out with words you didn't truly mean. In the moment, it felt justified. The anger was real, the emotions valid. But later, after the adrenaline faded, you might have replayed the situation in your mind, wishing you had handled it differently, wishing you had taken a breath, chosen your words more carefully, responded with clarity rather than emotion. Reactions are natural. They are our brain's way of protecting us, a fight or flight mechanism designed to keep us safe. When we perceive a threat, whether physical or emotional, our instinct kicks in, our pulse quickens, our muscles tense, our mind races. This is hardwired into us, a survival mechanism from the earliest days of humanity when danger required instant action. But the problem is, not all threats are created equal. The frustration of being cut off in traffic is not the same as being chased by a predator. And yet, our body responds in a similar way, flooding us with emotions that push us to act before we've had time to think. The challenge is that reacting often makes things worse. It turns small problems into big ones. It escalates conflicts rather than resolving them. A careless reaction in a moment of anger can cost us relationships, opportunities, and trust. It can lead to words we can't take back, actions we regret, damage that is difficult to undo, and once the reaction is set in motion, we can't rewind. But a response is different. A response is deliberate. It requires discipline, self-awareness, and the ability to pause, to create space between the trigger and the action. Responding means recognizing our emotions without being controlled by them. It means asking, what outcome do I want here, instead of simply acting on impulse. The difference between reaction and response is the difference between pouring fuel on a fire and putting it out. It's the difference between letting anger control us and using anger to drive us towards something productive. Because when we take the time to respond rather than react, we don't just change the outcome of a single moment, we change the trajectory of our relationships, our leadership, our lives. Perspective shapes everything. It's the lens through which we interpret the world, the filter that determines whether we see obstacles or opportunities, frustrations or fuel, setbacks or setups for something greater. And the most fascinating thing about perspective is that it's not fixed. It can be shifted, adjusted, expanded. Two people can experience the exact same situation, yet walk away with completely different interpretations, different emotions, and ultimately different outcomes. Take any moment of anger or frustration. The situation itself is objective. It simply exists. But what we make of it, how we choose to interpret it, is entirely up to us. The same event that can ruin one person's day can inspire another to take action. The same challenge that one person sees as an excuse to quit, another sees as a reason to push forward. Imagine two employees working under the same difficult boss. One sees the constant criticism as discouraging, making them feel undervalued, leading to resentment, and eventually causing them to disengage. The other sees the criticism as an opportunity to grow, using it as feedback to refine their skills and prove their value. Same boss, same words, same environment, two completely different experiences simply because of how they chose to view the situation. Perspective isn't just about attitude, it's about control. When we believe that external circumstances dictate our emotions, we give up our power. We become victims of every little frustration, every unfair moment, every difficult person we encounter. But when we shift our perspective, we reclaim that power. We stop seeing situations as things happening to us and start seeing them as things happening for us. Think about people who have faced extreme adversity. Nelson Mandela was imprisoned for 27 years. He had every reason to be bitter, every reason to see his captors as enemies, every reason to let anger consume him. But he chose a different perspective. He saw his time in prison as an opportunity to learn, to grow, to prepare for something bigger. Instead of letting anger destroy him, he used it to fuel his vision for a united South Africa. The same is true for so many great leaders, innovators, and changemakers. Their greatest frustrations became their greatest motivators, not because their circumstances were different, but because they saw them differently. The thing that infuriated them, the thing that made them want to give up, was the very thing that pushed them to make a difference. This shift in perspective doesn't mean ignoring reality. It doesn't mean pretending that challenges don't exist or forcing a false sense of positivity. What it means is taking control of the meaning we assign to events. When we feel anger or irritation, we have a choice. We can see it as a burden, as something negative weighing us down, or we can see it as information, as a tool, as something we can use to drive us forward. Our greatest power isn't in changing the world around us, it's in changing how we see it. Frustration is a universal experience. We all know what it feels like to hit a wall, to feel stuck, to want something to change, but not know how to make it happen. That feeling of irritation, that sense of restlessness, that internal pressure, it can be overwhelming. And for many people, frustration leads to one of two things: resignation or reaction. Some people, when faced with frustration, shut down. They convince themselves that things will never change, that the system is too broken, that the problem is too big. They become cynical, disengaged, and passive. Instead of using their frustration as a motivator, they allow it to drain them, to wear them down, to convince them that nothing they do will matter. Others let frustration consume them in a different way. They lash out, direct their anger at the people around them, or act impulsively without considering the long-term consequences. They become reactive rather than strategic, allowing emotion to dictate their choices rather than channeling it into something productive. But there's a third path, one that the greatest leaders, thinkers, and innovators have taken time and time again. They don't suppress frustration, and they don't let it explode uncontrollably. Instead, they convert it into fuel. Every major movement in history, every great innovation, every world-changing idea was born from some level of frustration. Frustration with injustice, frustration with inefficiency, frustration with outdated systems, broken processes, and unnecessary obstacles. The people who make the biggest impact in the world aren't the ones who avoid frustration, they're the ones who use it. Think about Martin Luther King Jr. He saw the injustice and inequality in society, and it frustrated him. But instead of letting that frustration turn into hopelessness or blind rage, he transformed it into a vision of a better, more just world. That frustration fueled his speeches, his activism, his leadership. It gave him the energy to keep pushing forward, even in the face of resistance. Or take Steve Jobs. He was frustrated by the way computers looked and operated. He believed technology should be simpler, more intuitive, more beautiful. Instead of complaining about the flaws in the industry, he created something better. His frustration didn't just linger, it became the foundation for one of the most revolutionary companies in history. Even in sports, you see this transformation happen. The greatest athletes use frustration as motivation. When they lose a game, when they fail to hit a target, when they don't perform at their best, they don't just get angry and give up. They analyze, they train harder, they push themselves beyond what they thought was possible. That frustration doesn't weaken them, it sharpens them. And it's not just world leaders, inventors, or athletes. This applies to everyday life. People who turn frustration into fuel are the ones who create change in their communities, who push for better policies at work, who find creative solutions to everyday problems. Instead of saying, "Why is this happening to me?" they ask, "What can I do about it?" But here's the thing, frustration alone isn't enough. It's just raw energy, and like any energy, it can be wasted or it can be directed. The key is in the redirection. It's in taking that irritation and asking, how can I use this? What does this frustration tell me? What's the problem beneath the problem? And what can I do to change it? This shift in mindset is what separates those who remain stuck from those who create meaningful impact. Because frustration isn't a dead end. It's a starting point. It's the spark that ignites something bigger, but only if we know how to use it. It's easy to judge. It's easy to assume we know exactly why someone acted the way they did, why they made that decision, why they hold that belief. It's easy to react with frustration, with defensiveness, with contempt, especially when we feel disrespected, unheard, or misunderstood. But here's the thing, judgment closes doors, curiosity opens them, and the way we choose to engage with the world, whether through curiosity or through contempt, shapes everything. When we lead with contempt, we assume the worst. We assume that people who disagree with us are ignorant, that people who challenge us are against us, that people who frustrate us are intentionally trying to make our lives harder. We don't ask questions, we make conclusions, and in doing so, we create distance. Contempt doesn't solve problems. It deepens them. Think about any argument you've ever had where neither side was willing to listen. You're not debating anymore, you're defending. You're preparing your next response before the other person has even finished speaking. You're locked in, convinced that you're right, that they're wrong, and that there's no point in even trying to understand. And what happens? Nothing changes. No one grows, no one learns. The divide only gets bigger. But when we replace contempt with curiosity, everything shifts. Curiosity allows us to step back, to pause, to ask, what's really going on here? Instead of assuming someone is being difficult, we wonder, why did they see it that way? What experience led them to this perspective? What am I missing? This doesn't mean we have to agree with everyone. It doesn't mean we have to accept every viewpoint as valid or excuse bad behavior. What it means is that instead of reacting with hostility, we approach situations with a desire to understand. And that shift, moving from assumption to exploration, opens the door for real conversation, for real connection, for real change. Think about the most influential leaders in history, the ones who didn't just demand compliance, but inspired real transformation, the ones who built bridges instead of burning them. They didn't lead with contempt. They didn't assume they had all the answers. They led with curiosity. They listened, they asked questions, they sought to understand before seeking to be understood. Nelson Mandela, after 27 years in prison, could have emerged bitter, hardened, ready to retaliate. Instead, he chose to listen. He chose to ask, how do we rebuild? How do we move forward? And in doing so, he led a nation through one of the most profound reconciliations in history. Even in business, the most successful leaders are the ones who ask, what am I missing? Instead of shutting down new ideas, they lean in, they challenge their own assumptions. They understand that the moment you think you know everything is the moment you stop growing. And this applies on the most personal level too, in our relationships, our workplaces, our communities. The next time someone frustrates you, instead of reacting with immediate judgment, try asking, what else could be true here? What might I not be seeing? What experience led them to think this way? Because when we lead with curiosity, we create the possibility for something new. We create the possibility for connection, for learning, for solutions we wouldn't have seen otherwise. And most importantly, we create the possibility for change, not just in others, but in ourselves. Frustration, anger, and conflict are inevitable, but they don't have to be destructive. When we see anger as a signal, not a sentence, when we turn frustration into fuel, when we choose response over reaction, and when we lead with curiosity instead of contempt, we open the door to growth, understanding, and transformation. The greatest leaders, innovators, and changemakers weren't void of these emotions, they just learned how to channel them. The choice isn't whether we experience frustration, the choice is what we do with it.